There are different ways anthropologists think about food. One basic way of doing it is in terms of what kinds of meals people consume. And usually we distinguish between usual, like ordinary, everyday, casual meals, and special meals we call feasts. There are two kinds of special meals. One kind of special meals are those where you just make them special because of scale, like a huge amount of stuff for everyone. There's a different kind of special meals when it's about how exquisite, how special the food is. We call them sometimes banquets or diacritical feasts. They're about having something that no one else can have, and it can be a relatively simple item, just inaccessible, say, in your area. Many classic Maya vessels mention that they drink pulque. Pulque is a plant that grows in arid climates. So to have something that grows in an arid climate, but in a tropical rainforest, is exotic. So pulque is not exotic in itself, but to be able to grow it in a completely different setting, and you cannot transport it over large distances because you have to harvest the sap. You kill the plant as you harvest the sap, and then the sap goes bad in a week as it ferments. So it's not like you can import it quickly from central Mexico where it's sort of natural habitat. You really have to grow it somehow in the Maya area. We actually still don't know how they did it, but they did. We have images, we have references, there's no question. But it must have required a tremendous amount of effort and know-how. It's not like you can just grow it in your backyard. So that's a banquet, something special, something inaccessible. And when we talk about food, there's no way around it. We really have to look at modern Maya languages and ethnographies of food in order to understand classic period texts. So I studied Tortillas, that's the only Maya language that I sort of speak, can translate, and it's also the language that is the closest to the language of the hieroglyphic inscriptions. So it's very interesting. The general term is we in Torti, same as in hieroglyphic inscriptions. And then there's a further distinction of like how actually you eat it. So koshi is when you use like you incisors. So you like slice the food as a predator, right? So meat. But say you eat a watermelon and you cannot koshi a watermelon. It's maki, which is like munching. It's like depending on which part of your mouth is engaged, it's actually a different term. Or what kind of food is engaged. It's like we're omnivorous, we wear things, but koshi is meat-like stuff, and maki is munching like soft fruit, porridge. There are no spoons or forks or knives for eating food. So you eat with your hands or you drink. People don't eat much in Chorti. In part, even today in Hokotan, there's really not much to eat. So hunger is common, even today, between the harvests especially. Towards the end of the year, when all the corn is you have is your seed corn. And you cannot eat your seed corn, obviously. So craving and like giving way to your cravings is not okay. That's being punir, like a lustful, craving person, is a bad thing. People don't eat meat that much. So in the past and in the present, my people are vegetarian. They can eat some meat, and even when they do eat meat, it's wrapped in cornbread, ground, mixed with something, and wrapped, sort of domesticated. My professor of Torti told me a story how he went to a conference in Antigua, Guatemala. He was brought in and paid by the organizers, and then they took them to a restaurant, and there was steak there, like half raw. And he was in shock that people can eat meat like that, like animals, basically. And that's why forest spirits, the devil, and foreigners are cannibals. Because there's some truth in that. You go to town and you see white people eating meat like animals, and they don't even cook it fully, right? They still see blood in it. That's disgusting if you're a Maya person. People drink a lot of water now. You can also drink Atol, Sa, and Chorti, it actually means anything of porridge-like quality. So like a construction mix would also be Sarum, like the Sa from earth. And then of course you can drink maize brew, maize beer, maize chicha, which is a Spanish word chicha, and cacao, if you can afford it. And then smoking is but. You can also chew tobacco, koi is chew, and of course what you but, and koi is kuts, tobacco. So these are kinds of patterns of consumption. If you starve, starving is winar. It's kind of cut off. I don't know what's going on with the screen. So winar is when you don't have enough food and you become thin, high. Muni, to fill yourself, but usually it's a negative term, like you stuff yourself, like you cannot stop. And then if you get drunk, the term is kar, and karner is drunkenness, a hangover, constant drinking. And remember, there is a god, Bolon Talnel Chak, which is precisely an equivalence of the Chorti term karner, so the god of eternal drinking. Healthy in boots, I really like that in Chorti, another word for healthy is tokor, which literally means flinty. It's like if you look like a nice piece of flintstone, like shiny, bright, hard, right? Which would say some sharp as a rock or as a stone, and this idea, right? It's a good stone, it's a good look, flinty look, literally, like that eccentric flint from around Copan, present-day Turkey area. Utsik generally means good, so same as in Puts. So that's when people eat well, but not too much. This notion of moderation is very important because there are always people who are starving. It is very likely that just like Chorti today, ancient Maya ate about twice a day with liquid meals and maybe one solid meal. A lot of food was drinks, mostly Atol, and then maybe something else. Tamales would be special food, or perhaps food for exceptionally rich people, very much like it is today. Cooking practices were probably similar. Our problem is that food preparation is almost never shown in Maya art, so we know very little. Our vast information comes from archaeology. So we have only one fully excavated kitchen in the Maya era that actually has everything preserved in it. It was destroyed by a volcano, very much like Pompeii in Italy, except this was a simple village in Hoya de Seren, present-day Salvador. And so we have a full kitchen with shelving, with everything still in storage. And generally, it looks like some campesinos, some peasants back then, had a better life than peasants today. Their food is more diverse, they have more possessions per family unit, and some varieties of food they eat, such as Maniac, are actually better varieties compared to the ones available today. But that's, the heritage of colonialism that we have to deal with. These are Maya glyphs for eating, and they're based on a sign for mouth, ti. So there's a mouth with water, a mouth with tamal, with a cornbread, and, well, a mouth with a cigar. The cigar may be one of those Mayan words which actually got adopted into English, cigar. So eating, mouth, drinking, eating, and perhaps smoking. There's a second variety of the eating glyph that shows a sign for human in the mouth. Those are, fortunately, not very common, but they do suggest that the Maya scribes considered it as a kind of eating as well, like sort of typical eating. This is a sign for tzak that contains a shar glyph, a syllable u. And then you see the bread, the tamal, water, and the suffix ah. It's one of those binary couplets suggesting that eating and drinking, or water and tamal, are those essential pairs which together enable our sustenance, our existence. With respect to how Maya eat, it's kind of hard to figure out what is going on when you look at scenes, especially in classical Maya pottery. Those are obviously elite interpretations of what life was like, of what food was like. It's kind of hard to decide, are they actually going to eat anything, or are they going to present? Are they going to just watch? And of course, where those actions are happening. It's kind of hard to figure those things out. This is what a Maya term for feasting looks like from at least some hieroglyphic inscriptions. Literally, eat, drink, like Pulque. And we see it in hieroglyphic codices. This is one of the support from a ritual offering plate. So I guess saying feasting for the gods, and it shows an offering of a jaguar. So I guess some gods really had great offerings of jaguar for their own sustenance. Um, this is from a codex. I really like this drinking vessel. It literally says, eat, drink, eat, drink, eat, drink, ukwe, ukwe. So you see, and there's a very happy god depicted. So feasting, feasting. Um, this is probably not a banquet in the sense that everyone is pretty wasted. And the sense of decorum is not preserved here. But that also seems to be part of a joke or a sense of humor of the author, because it's really emphasized. Everyone here is presented formally as if they're making a proper entrance, but you can see that they're all unable to stand. So this caption, for example, says, shark-tailed deer or fire-tailed deer, the priest, my lord, his attendants, my lord. So you can kind of see that this is actually someone who is supported by two of his assistants, no longer able to stand. So that seems to be a part of a catch of that joke, or the notion that this is a funny scene, that these people are all wasted. You can see they're carrying bags around their necks. Those are probably vomiting sacs. So the idea that you drink so much alcohol that it induces vomiting, and then you drink more, because it's not a very strong alcohol. So if you really want to get drunk, you have to take a lot of it and then vomit and take more, hoping that the alcohol gets absorbed and the liquid is just, goes away. Enemas are, of course, used by the Maya too. Some of them probably contain psychoactive substances. Some of them are clearly labeled as pulque. So you can also ingest alcohol anally. There is some evidence. This is just a talk I watched on Sunday, Clarissa Cognata's work. There's evidence of laxatives in Maya feasting deposits. Perhaps some of those enema scenes actually not about ingesting, but about emptying your bowels so that you could eat more, very much like Roman style. Because Romans would take some vomiting substances so that they could empty the bowels to be able to consume more. And it looks like Maya feasting deposits contain laxatives, which they perhaps could ingest or take via enema, and then so that they could continue eating and enjoying different kinds of foods. So different cultures, similar solutions. Except, of course, I'm not sure if Roman like enemas. This is a nice scene. Two individuals are about to drink a jar of pulque, and you can see that they're holding little cups, but there's also an enema. So they're like, what shall we do? Cups or enemas? Cups or enemas? So this is my idea of a party. Kind of hard to imagine how it was actually happening, like in palace scenes. Usually most of the enemas that we see in sort of courtly setting, they don't really show people using them. They're sort of there. Whatever is happening stays behind the doors or behind the screens as far as enemas are concerned. Very few images of actually people doing that. And of course, a lot of vomiting seems to be part of the process. Colonial period Maya use the bark of the Pulque tree that they would mix with honey wine, and that would induce vomiting. And vomiting was also part of the process. And this scene shows something very similar to what colonial texts describe. So an individual is vomiting, and it's interesting that this is the old god. This is the goddess Chakchel, goddess of childbirth, creation, and destruction. And the female attendants are wearing dresses with peculiar kinds of circular markings. Those are described in colonial sources as the priestesses of the Pulque drink and related rituals, which are often about rainmaking. There's a graffiti in the palace that I study at the site of Homun. We actually have scenes like this of people vomiting into bowls in graffiti. So I have at least 2 images like that, about this tall, on the walls of the living room of the palace. Something probably was actually happening there. And these are inscriptions from the Spanish colonial period sources. And I'm not going to quote the original text, but it's all about the fact that In the past, people used to be a lot healthier. Remember, these are Spanish colonial authorities reporting back to Madrid, to other locations of colonial period authorities. And everyone used to be happier because they had this great drink called Dulce that made them purge their intestines and was very healthy. And it's no longer allowed by the local church authorities. And therefore, everyone is sick and sad. And sometimes they would say, and dying from sadness. So we have a lot of these inscriptions saying that this was not just good, emotionally speaking, but also healthy to consume alcohol and alcohol vomit. I mean, it's hard to believe those texts, but that was sort of the general assumption that these things were meant to be good for you, purging your system with drinking. It's not our notion of what a banquet should be. Like vomiting is usually not part of our drinking parts, though it does happen quite a bit, especially in college. But that was sort of a structural feature of Maya drinking parties, up to these like little vomiting bags. I guess sometimes it's just not very comfortable to carry your own bowl all the time with you, right? So a little sack is more discreet and convenient. So a lot of Maya scenes, though, they're very unclear with respect to what is going on. So we see usually it's an image of so-and-so with drinks, or it's an image of someone sitting with drinks. It's not like they say, this is a banquet, this is a feast. Perhaps we're looking at events which have multiple things going on, and an exchange of drinks or food is only part of those. This is one of my favorite scenes, which is a banquet. It says in the text that they're going to drink tikal cacao or with cal cacao. So it's either hot chocolate or spiked chocolate, like spiked with alcohol, like Irish chocolate. And they are, as you can see, not drinking yet. And I think that's what a lot of these scenes depict. They depict the beginning. Like they're not showing us the party at its peak or at the tail end. Those things are not for random visitors to see. So we are positioned in these scenes just outside of the palace usually, like looking at the entrance or through the entrance. And then the curtains probably would close and then we'll be like outside, no longer being able to figure out what's going on. It's kind of interesting perspective. This scene has speeches, and that once again confirms that we're looking at the beginning of the party. The visitors say, you had Kachan, our guardian, for 17 20-year cycles. So they claim that the host has obligations of protection to them. And those obligations are ancient, right? The host answers, me or this, it's not very clear what he wants to say here. Ahanal, akushbi. Ahanal, what does it mean? Ahanal. Which pronoun would that be? Sorry?
The second person.
Yeah, so your sustenance, ahanal. Kushbih, your enlivening. Like kush, ban is literally to, kush is to live. So if I ever wanted to say that my birthday, there would be something like kushantin, like the day of my life, the day of me becoming a living being. And so kushbih is something that happens when you drink alcohol. And so he literally says here, this is your food, these are your drinks. And then continues, ukapsi amam, as he had overseen it, or as he had ordered it, your grandpa. It's like the grandpa is not in the scene, he's long dead. But in spirit, he commands the host to offer drinks to his visitors. So that's how Maya think, right? It's all about grandpas. The obligations that they had, relationships that they had, that they're living on just following the orders. And Yashun Balam, of course, is the name of the grandpa. Lovely Katinga Jaguar. So that's how a host probably would say to his guests, right? Ahanal, akushbih, and then add something as to why it is happening. This is another example when people are pouring drinks and they say, Kushban awol, Let your heart be happy, or make your heart happy. So that's about alcohol, of course. And they're drinking pulque here and honey wine. So be happy. Well, this is a bit harder. There's a scene, and they're just sitting with pulque or without. This one is without, although this person says something, si mich avol, your heart is sim. Unfortunately, we don't know what that verb means. There are only two examples in the entire corpus. No good cholen a gloss. So we can read it out loud. It's written phonetically. Once here, once in the inscription on the side of 29 Chiapas. And it's always verbs, and it's always someone telling someone about heart. So presumably it's an emotional state. Hopefully something good, because they're drinking. The person here is holding a little cup. And it's interesting because this cup in the scene is identical to the actual cup on which it is written. So you almost wonder if they're really talking about that. And additional food has been offered here as well, with a little caption, probably what this person is saying to the seated ruler. So that's the usual way of Maya talking about food. Now, the cups themselves, they actually come in different sizes, very much like what we see in art. They're large cups. So you cannot possibly imagine someone just taking it and drinking. So those are presumably meant to change hands. And then you can kind of see from the size of the cup what's the target audience, right? This is for a large party. You can barely hold it when it's full. You almost wonder if those cups were ever meant to be filled. They're like statements about the desired size of a party. This seems like a reasonable amount for among 6 or 7 people passing on a cup of chocolate. This is more like a personal cup. When we see something else like production or exchange of food items, as in the market scenes at Colonial, then you see these enormous jars for storing food. Something we also see archaeologically, of course, at the household level. So this is a big jar for grain, most likely, or a big basket for tamales. Or here, you can see a basket that serves as a stall, and then there's a large plate on which the person poured corn drink, Atol, presumably to cool it down. Large and flat. We don't see plates like this in the context of serving food. So if you're excavating a household, you would not find plates of that size in the assemblages immediately around it. Those are not for serving. This is presumably something you can see in the market or large-scale storage or distribution of food. Very different objects. So these are special containers. Those are inscribed. They have special themes, like this one is covered with images of demons of the night. This one is called Striking God of Madness, Hatz Akan. This is Scaffold Jaguar. And this fellow is just called Fire. So the demon of fire, something you can send upon your enemies. And they'll belong to different families, of course. In a provincial capital, of course, these special containers will be somewhat less elaborate. So, for example, this is the site of Naranjo where I work. This is the provincial subordinate vassal family of Homul. They're about 20 miles apart. And you can see they're very similar, but the provincial workshop is not as good as the capital workshop. And the glyphs themselves are not as good. It's kind of interesting how it happens. Tags on these vassals often identify scribes, as I have already mentioned. So these objects are circulating sometimes as precious gifts, as commissioned labor. You would not find any of that on, usual ceramic containers. Even beautiful polychrome ceramic containers you find in ordinary households. The vassals are often accompanied with what we call dedicatory formula. It's a very repetitive, very formulaic text, and it's usually on the rims of the vassals. And it starts with alai, that unfortunately it's cutting out here a little more than usual today, but it means here. And then abai, it goes up, presumably referring to the act of raising an object as presenting something that is finished. And then utsibnach, if it's a painted vessel, literally the painting, the decoration of something. And then yukib, which would be a common reference to drinking utensils. Uk, to drink. Ukib, an instrument for drinking. And then the contents. In this case, Tai Shimtel cacao. The Ishimte ish chocolate. Some debate about what Ishimte is, whether it's a specific ingredient, a kind of tree that has medicinal properties, ethnographically documented, or a reference to the maize god in his tree form, with pods of cacao growing out of his body. So either it's high poetry or something very specific. And here's another one. Yukip, the drink utensil. Ta for utal, fruity, ishimtel, ishimteish, cacao. Those are typical examples of the dedicatory text on pottery. That naranjo vase with swearing rabbit. Remember, this is the text. And I actually made a mistake here when I was doing the transcription. I wrote it as u-ha-yi. In fact, it is written as u-ha, the full head of the moon goddess, and ya. This is one of those Latin harmonic spellings on pottery. So the usual sequence would be ha-yi, and here it's ha-ya. The vowel length basically collapsed by that time, and the scribe is no longer representing it. And then yukip, his drink utensil, and then ti yutal cacao. You can see that some texts say ti, other texts say ta. There is no distinction except a dialectal between these two prepositions, ti and ta. So this one has ta, ishim, that one has ta, and this one at Naranjo has ti. So painting, there are several terms. They're all based on the verb tlib, to paint, but there seems to be different ways of saying it. Tlib nahal, tlibal, tlibal nahal. And it seems that these are like different ways of deriving, adding extra grammatical markers. So tlibal seems to be the basic form of the verb, to paint, to decorate. Then tlibal, something painted, decorated. Tlibna, something that was painted, decorated. And tlibnahal, further nominal derivation from it. These are kind of very long compound nouns. And some of this difference is regional. There are certain places where you only see tlibnahal. And record as tzibinah or utzibinahala. Obviously, this would be a passive voice. Tzibnah, and we of course cover it when we talk about passive voice. Not yet. We're not there yet. And this utzibinaha, probably for nahal. And this is utzibal and then utzibanahala. So just different ways of writing. These either shorter or more extended versions of painted or decorated. It's very important to remember that tzib can mean writing, but only in the sense that things done with a brush. It's not the glyphs, the characters themselves would be woch. That would be writing as we would probably define it. Wohol, writing. Glyphs. This is more like painting. So it refers not to just inscriptions, but anything painted on the body of the vessel. And then this is the term for carving, which is usual wahal, or yulush wahal. It seems to be a couplet. So it actually means ush, ul, and ush is to carve, and ul is to polish. So carve, polish. So sometimes it is ushul, and sometimes it is ulush. Like the order of these words doesn't matter, and then you add a suffix to it, wah, which just seems to be deriving a verb out of it, or verb and then the noun. So they're carved, and of course you see those things only on carved vessels, or incised vessels, or incised and polished. Most of them are both incised and polished, or carved and polished. And this, of course, the usual way to write hayi, hai, thin, and that's a generic term for fine vessels, which have thin walls, something thin. I mean, thin, fine, also different from English. So this is a scene, of course, from the Calakmul market scenes, and this is an actual vendor of hai. So every household you start excavating would have some hai, but not all of them would be inscribed. And not all of them would be inscribed with real glyphs. I'd say for every sherd with an actual text, there'd be like 20 or 30 with fake glyphs. Very much like, fake Rolexes versus real Rolexes. Everyone wants to have text with glyphs. And there's a debate why you need that. Like, what's the point? Whether it's about prestige or perhaps magic. A lot of these texts are around the rim of the vessel, perhaps protecting it as well from, poisoning or evil spirits. The dedicatory texts mention different kinds of vessels. So it's kind of Maya emic typology. Anthropologists use these terms, emic and edict, when they describe things the way we see them and the way the native speakers or members of a particular culture see them. So from my point of view, these objects are luck. And the best analogy that we have is plate. But lucks, they vary from what we would think as shallow plate to like a dip dish. They're all luck. Some lucks are called haute. We have no idea what haute is. We can read it out loud. But it includes the term for stick, te. How stick or how wood, haute. And those are large flat plates with everted rims and supports, which usually contain rattles. So those are haute. But the same kind of thing can also be a luck, suggesting that luck is a general category and haute something functional, something more specific. So this is a luck for tamales, and it's also a waybil, literally eating utensil. Remember, there are no utensils as such in the Maya area. Everybody eats with fingers. So the concept of utensil is actually something that refers to the pottery. So drinking cups are drinking utensils, and plates are eating utensils. So this is an eating utensil, waybil, someone's eating utensil, of course. Curiously, there are no comales, or almost no comales or tortilla grills during the Classic period. These are a few examples from the site of Shunantunich, just at the end of the Classic, around 750, 800. And you can see what this particular piece is from. So it'll be like a large, flat ceramic dish. And that's for firing and making tortillas. Tortillas, of course, are very important in present-day Maya cuisine. Say in tortilla, pa is tortilla, and then tamal is pakatpa, literally wrapped tortilla. Now, in classic Maya text, there's only wah, tamal. There are no references to tortillas whatsoever. And ceramic analysis also shows that the ceramic shapes associated with the production of tortillas are not present. That means a lot. It actually means a lot in terms of how you consume food. Of course, tortillas are a snack that you can eat outdoors. And that's essential for when you go to farm some distance from home, the present day like slash and burn agriculture, distant farming, and males, they take tortillas and with them, and they go and they eat. Doesn't seem to be a thing for the classic Maya. And all kinds of implications. They use more intensive agriculture. They don't farm so far from home. And they're probably not just men doing the agriculture. All kinds of little implications. That well-preserved Salvadorian village, cornfields are all high intensity, sort of using fertilizers, agriculture right next to homes. Very different kind of farming compared to many communities. And the main reason, of course, there used to be such a drastic population collapse right after the arrival of the Spaniards because of the diseases. 90% of the population was wiped out in the first 50 years. Millions of people just died within 2 generations. So you can imagine how empty the landscape had become. So a lot of people could do slash and burn agriculture. And believe it or not, the population numbers never recovered. Even today, there are few indigenous people that say at the peak of the Maya civilization in Guatemala. And so what we imagine as sort of natural Maya way of doing agriculture was nothing like that, most likely, during the Classic period. And it's reflected in the food they eat and the terms they use. This is one of my favorite. It's a chip and dip plate, unfortunately looted, so we don't know where it came from, probably from around Naranjo. And you can see it has inbuilt areas for sauce. And that, of course, implies this kind of snack food. And those become common towards the end of the Classic period. You almost wonder whether it's something different about parties, the nature of these public banquets. This is very much like our parties. People walk around, they need a snack. Those are supposedly to be served cold, right, with sauce. In this case, 3 different kinds. This is a luck, a plate, but it's a luck ta cacao, plate for chocolates. What is also interesting about this luck, it is a plate for chocolates for the king when he embodies the sun god of war. So he emerges from the palace dressed for battle with a flint and the shield, according to this inscription, and then probably says something like, "Where are my chocolates?" But you have to think that this is probably not sweet chocolate, right? It's concentrated chocolate with spice, with chile, and of course it's a tonic too, right? It contains the caffeine, the theobromine, so it's probably the notion that it fills you with energy. The Maya warriors went to battle chewing on chocolates. That's how we eat chocolates today, but that seems to be the case with the Mayans. Chocolates and war.
That's how the Germans use chocolate in the Second World War.
Yeah, so not so unusual. So sun god, weapons, and chocolates, the Maya way. This is one of those vessels called haute. This one is called yellow foot haute. It actually has yellow supports. It also means that these vessels, they're like bodies, they're life. A lot of them have energy, right? They're animistic, they're living entities. Something very important to remember. This vessel is a rare subtype of plates called awakening utensils. So maybe because they contain chocolates or some other stuff. Some haute vessels literally also mention awakening. They must be part of like maybe party vessels or maybe breakfast plates, who knows? But there's a term, right? And different kind of use, awakening. So late classic food, as I mentioned, a lot of emphasis on display. So perhaps these diacritical feasts or perhaps small snacks that people can share as they eat. Now, it's interesting that there is no notion of bowls in Maya typology. So they're told drinking utensils and they're eating utensils and plates. There's no term that describes things in between. So archaeologists always had this notion of bowls as a kind of ratio of height to width or diameter. And it doesn't correspond to any kind of internal classification. The only thing that we can say is that generally flatter drinking vessels are for atol, for a drink made out of corn, like a corn soup. And taller vessels seem to be for chocolate, cacao. But they're both drinking utensils. Now, the glyph itself, the drinking, it's a mouth with water. Early images are very literal. You can see you and then it's very realistic mouth, like chewing on a glyph for water. And then towards the end, they get very stylized. So like this. So what you have is just the mustache and part of the mouth. They just become this stylized element on top. And this is the sign for water. And this is the same stuff with the B. Like they actually mentioned, they include the suffix here, they drop the suffix. It's hard to read those, but usually from context, it's not so difficult because you're looking at a description on a vessel. Now, outside of that immediate context, that would be hard to figure out what is actually going on. So this is tamal, Maya tamales, wach. Of course, in that scene on the Calakmul that's very obvious. This is a reference to the most elaborate tamal that I know of, one of the most elaborate tamals, the pepita de ayote, sahak, deer meat, chich, tamal. So like I guess sauce of pepita de ayote, a calabash seed, and then deer meat, and then the tamal itself. And we often see tamales in art kind of with some kind of sprinkling of sauce. Those must have been really important. Maybe some of those plates for chocolate are also placed for, say, something like mole. This is a rare tamal. It says uwe bil, the eating utensil, and 5-flour tamal. Now we do find carbonized remains of flowers in Maya feasting deposits. And the big questions, are they part of the decoration or part of what people actually ate? So this text implies that there was a tamale with no less than 5 kinds of flowers in it. So that seems to be in favor that those flowers were actually eaten. A lot of Maya texts deal with cacao. There are different varieties of cacao. And it's very important to remember, cacao is not just the beans, but the fruit itself. The way we consume the beans, we let the fruit rot because we cannot digest unfermented beans. Very much like coffee. Same idea. The fruit has to rot, then you wash away what is left, and you're left with the beans. Or you can allow a monkey eat the cacao fruit, and then you collect the pulp with the beans. Some even suggested that Mayas did that on purpose, very much like that, exquisite coffee consumed by a variety of, I always forget the name of the animal. And then you collect it and you sell it for like 1,000 times more expensive than the normal coffee. So somebody suggested mice actually went after like howler monkeys and collected the beans for the most exquisite coffee. Chocolate in this case. So we don't know. But it's interesting that some reference to the cacao may actually refer to the fruit. And we know today people can drink the fruit, like juice. And there's no way to distinguish in the text. But there's cacao in general. There's cacao, fresh cacao. Tikal cacao, either hot or spiked. Sahal cacao, literally gruelish cacao, that may be consistency or mixing with maize. Utal, fruity. Tsa, sweet cacao, suggesting that yes, they had some sweet cacao from time to time, but most of those cacao drinks were not sweet at all. So they were probably hot, spicy, but not sweet. Kabil cacao is also very common. Honey cacao. At Naranco, the place that I love most, because that's my area, they had 5 honey cacao, suggesting that they had 5 varieties of honey. And it must have been a really exquisite thing, right? And then cherry cacao. So adding a variety of wild cherry, capulin, I think, to their chocolate drinks. This variety of cacao, I'm not sure that I would drink. Cacao with lima beans. Doesn't strike me as a natural combination. But remember, this is not a sweet drink, most likely. So we're kind of moving towards mole-like things. And then can cacao, ripe cacao, presumably the opposite of ach cacao, fresh or raw cacao. There must have been difference. Maybe fermentation or perhaps the stage of the fruit itself. So those are possibilities. And of course, this is what a drink from a fruit looks like today, called pocha de cacao in parts of Guatemala and Salvador. So the actual fruit and the drink. And you can see the beans inside. So you can actually drink it, and perhaps that's how people learned that fermented beans can actually be eaten and consumed, because they were making alcoholic chicha out of it, and they discovered that the byproduct of that chicha is actually also digestible and contains good things inside, and it makes you feel better and happier. So this is cacao. We have very few images of people actually making a foam, and that's what Aztecs prized most about cacao at the time of the Spanish arrival, the actual foam made out of pouring the boiled hot chocolate. So this is a lady actually making one by pouring from vessel to vessel. We don't know what percentage of Maya vessels with cacao in the scriptures were actually used for this kind of work, for this kind of food. Residue analysis so far has been inconclusive. We don't see quantities of theobromine in some of these vessels, suggest that they were actually used for chocolate foam, for concentrated chocolate. This is the other kind of drink, which is very common, and much more common, of course, than cacao, because cacao, you're literally eating money or drinking money. So it's very wasteful. But maize drinks are common, and in fact, many so-called cacao drinks, based on what the ethnographic sources tell us, or ethnohistoric sources tell us, they're mostly maize drinks with some chocolate sprinkled into them. So they're like chocolate in name only for the most part. So this is sa. The general term is ul and sa. And ul means fresh, like atol, corn drink from freshly harvested corn. And obviously you cannot drink something from freshly harvested corn every day. So there seems to be a difference between sort of aspirational drinks, like what a proper noble house should drink every day. Every day is going to be fresh corn. And reality. I mean, corn is fresh only during harvest, and that's pretty much it. And then achahul and paul, bitter atol and sour atol. These are very common drinks today called pozole and piñole in local varieties of Spanish. And those are from ground and sometimes toasted maize. It's sometimes allowed to ferment a little bit. And then chocolate atol, the people who have enough honesty in them to accept that it's actually mostly maize rather than mostly chocolate, sort of like glass half full, glass half empty. So cacao would mean like chocolatish maize drink, as opposed to sal cacao, which would be the opposite, like mostly chocolate, according to the text. And then sweet potato atol, which is a kind of drink people still drink today. We have vessels, and interesting, one of the bowls of the right size actually was discovered to contain sweet potato starches. But there are also other kinds of bowls. This is a bowl for chilies. So it says each high. So presumably there'll be a sauce, or perhaps whole chilies. Of course, there's no way to tell. And it's interesting that chilies also come in bottles. So we have bottles for chilies, suggesting that those were probably powdery and used as spice to add to foods. I don't think that they were sniffing chilies. That would be a little extreme. Like sniffing red chili powder, unlikely. At least from my point of view, who knows? This one is a bowl for Lima beans. Remember, there's a vessel for Lima bean chocolate. I actually deciphered that hieroglyph, so I wasn't sure whether or not it made sense, but I published it anyway. And then the German hieroglyphic database team came up on this plate, which made more sense as a plate for beans. And it's interesting that it has actually decorated with what is probably an image of the vine and the beans. So it made sense and kind of confirmed my idea about the decipherment of that hieroglyph for beans or lima beans in my writing. So sometimes you get strange combinations. This is avocado water. It's a drinking cup for avocado water. It's like Californians of some sort, West Coast. It didn't take off. This is the only one we know. Late 6th century, early 7th century, around the site of Naranjo has the local hummingbird god depicted on the body of the vessel. All of these inscriptions are not about what people really ate or drank day to day. It's about what is proper, what is desirable, sort of fancy things. And of course, that's a matter of social consensus. So like from time to time, people come up with new ideas. Avocado water. And it just doesn't make the waves. And that generation, they don't paint vessels for avocado water anymore. It's kind of interesting because it's a social process of deciding what is acceptable and what is not. Now, Sakha doesn't appear frequently in the inscriptions on serving vessels, but it's a term for sacred beverage for the gods. So presumably not every vessel you see is for the gods, and so you don't see that Sakha very often. It's mostly a corn-based drink with sprinkling of chocolate. So white water. But we do see it from time to time in the text, suggest that those are perhaps meant not for humans entirely, but just for the gods to drink, to consume Sakha. And then occasionally there are vessels which are clearly not meant for the living at all, like those made out of stone and jade and made for the graves. So this jade vessel actually says something along the lines, already he drinks his chocolate, presumably in the afterlife. And so the kind of beverage that these cacao vessels contain is called kan nabnal ishimte cacao, the precious pool place ishimte chocolate. That's the tree of life growing in the other world, like beyond the veil. So I don't think that they actually contain anything when they're buried, right? They will become full with that other chocolate. Or perhaps they were filled with something else like mercury, who knows? But that's pretty much the idea, right? Not every beverage is even real, like from our point of view, of course, not from their point of view. So, and this is a nice combination of the special drink on very special vessels, made either from travertine or jade. Pulque, of course, is mentioned, not very often. Remember, it's a very exotic drink. This is either a wooden or most likely an actual gourd vessel that was stuccoed and painted. The gourd itself decayed entirely, but archaeologists recovered the paint by filling the voids with plaster of Paris. So then the paint would stick to the plaster. You would recover actual objects. So that approach was tried at the site of Tikal, and that's why we have some perishable artifacts, remarkable objects, including this lid of a pulque vessel. And this is a logogram for pulque, chich. It looks like a skull with big maguey leaves. So they think of pulque as a skeletal being because its body is in the ground, very much like the rhizomes of water lilies. And it dies, and then you ferment, and then you basically collect it from the dead body of the pulque. So interesting notion of plants. And generally plants in Maya art, they grow head down because of course they drink from the ground. They eat from the ground. So they're face down. The roots are their arms and fingers, and the branches are the legs. And they have ears which look like jaguar claws, because of course in the tropical rainforest, that's what most plants are. They have thorns, lots of thorns, different kinds of thorns. Some of them are poisonous, some of them are not. But walking through the tropical rainforest, you can't just simply brush against the leaves. Just walk. You'll be like without your clothes pretty soon. But it's interesting, this kind of upside down, the skeletal idea of some plants. Perhaps because agave, it's kind of cactus too. It's different, right? It's kind of hard on the outside, soft on the inside, very much like insects. You can mix pulque with things. This one is called Utah Sa Chich, fruity white maize gruel pulque, like fruit punch, corn gruel, and alcohol. I'm not sure that mixing drinks is a great idea, even if you're a Maya person, but they did it at the site of Copan. Today they drink something they call Atol shuko, and it's basically spiked white Atol that perhaps is not so different from this stuff, but no pulque in it. This text is actually on an altar that probably contained an offering of that pulque. And the king drank it, and presumably members of the court drank it, but that must have been a very special event. If we plot some of these unusual combinations on a map, they actually cluster. So sour and bitter varieties of Atol are popular in the western part of the southern lowlands. Atolish chocolate is a thing of eastern Patan, especially around Naranco. We have multiple references. And then there are places like Tikal, which have a great variety of drinks. So large cosmopolitan cities, predictably, surprise, surprise, are places where people consume different varieties of drinks and foods, and also perhaps where preferences are set, like sort of trendsetters, the Parises of the Maya world, where people go and they trade and they attend the best parties, and then they come back with their ideas about what is proper and what is not. So if we plot these things, kind of gives us a sense of what the desired drinks are. So for example, cherry chocolate, we see it in central Patan and in around the eastern Patan sides, but not so much in like Campeche. Like the cherry and chocolate, they don't mix as much. Or the notion of eating chocolate with lima beans, it's only in the area of Riazul, doesn't take off. It's not embraced by other noble families. You can of course plot a lot more varieties here, but that's pretty much the idea. This is all about trend setting. It's interesting that some kinds of food that we know everybody eat are not represented at all, or almost not at all. Maniac. Maya people ate a lot of maniac, yuca, cassava. We know it from archaeological data, especially recently when people learned how to extract starches, like little pieces of food from mostly residue analysis on grinding tools, so like what people are grinding. And the basic idea, the common idea was they're mostly grinding corn. And recent investigations, for example, this is the site of La Corona, Western Patan, most of the grinding tools contain manioc. These people are eating lots of manioc, at least cooking a lot of manioc. This is from Clarissa Cognato's work and her colleague Ponce from 2017. Nobody's talking about manioc in classic Maya text. Yeah.
Is it because it's not like a special food? Like they wouldn't have like special plates?
Yeah, nobody's fond of potatoes, basically. Everybody eats potatoes, but nobody likes potatoes. This is maybe the only reference to manioc, and even that is ambiguous. This person is saying "Iul un bate," Three Atole Avocado Principal Lord Bate. It's almost head spear. That actually may be a name, but I suspect that this is actually what he's holding. And Tsi can be interpreted as dog, so like dog Atole, like they cooked a dog, which of course was a common meal too, although not mentioned on, nobody mentions dog tamales on plates for some reason. But it could also be tsin for yuca or manioc. And of course, atole from manioc is a common kind of drink today, like manioc ul. So that would make perfect sense. That would be just one example. If we look at isotopic data, maize is a C4 plant. It should have a very strong signature. People preferentially eat maize. And it's not until the late classic period when we start getting signatures of people really eating mostly corn. 1,000 years of the pre-classic period, they're eating something else. They may actually be preferential manioc eaters who then start eating more corn. Perhaps because corn is more prestigious. So once again, this is not necessarily about what people eat, but what people want to eat, what they would like to eat, what kind of food is important, precious. Like, there are no potato gods in my art, which is very interesting, right? No manioc deities. It's there, but somehow in terms of what is salient, what is important in the food culture, it's not on the surface. Perhaps because it's considered to be like a humble, common vegetable. Right? It's just, everyone has manioc, so what? Sweet potato is mentioned maybe twice as contents, and then there's like one female name. There was a lady sweet potato, one of the queens at Tikal. I guess it's a cute name. But once again, would you call your daughter a potato? That's the thing. It looks like most Mayans were like, no. Not all vessels are for eating. These are tobacco snuff bottles. Yotot umai, the container of his tobacco. And residue analysis confirms that those contain tobacco. Some of them actually contain a variety of nightshade, according to chemical analysis. Probably as a way of spiking it up a little bit for extra kick. If you're like snuffing that stuff. But not mentioned in the inscriptions. So the primary content is tobacco. And this is another interesting example of like the problem of trying to connect vessels and function. This little bowl is not for eating anything at all. It's called upokol cheb, cleaning brush utensil. So this is a bowl for cleaning your brushes. So when you're an artist, a noble artist, obviously, with a lot of extra means to afford something like this, that's what you use, right, for washing your brushes. And it's interesting that it was looted, right? We don't know exactly where that bowl came from, but that seems to be a plate that was looted from the same grave, the same owner, and it's a beautiful haote plate. And must have been like a very talented priest, Ahkun, from the city of Yotz, who was literally buried with some of his calligraphy work. And he had his own calligraphy brushes and calligraphy bowls for washing the brushes. And that's a problem for us because as archaeologists, imagine you find something like this and you immediately think this is for food if there are no text on it. But a lot of ceramic containers that we find archaeologically, they're not even for food at all. They have other needs, sometimes for storage, but also for all kinds of uses in the courtly culture. And it's very hard to figure them out. This is another example. This is an archaeological excavation, and it happened at the archaeological site of Uxul in Campeche, southern Mexico. And you can see there's a large undecorated bowl, about this big, right? And then there's a small cylinder vessel, exactly like the drinking vessels, except that this is not a drinking vessel at all. It is upokol kab, hand cleaner. So I guess the idea is that you pour it and you wash your hands and the water goes presumably in the bowl. So imagine how many of those we actually have in the archaeological record. And until this thing came around, and as a set, right, in someone's grave, so that I guess he could keep his hands clean in the afterworld. And for some reason, he happened to be the only cleanness-obsessed person excavated by archaeologists. Or perhaps other graves contain similar items, we just think that they're not, right? That they're for other things, for actual food. So maybe some of the ceramic vessels that we have in the graves actually for they're hand washing basins, right? And pouring. And of course, it still wouldn't make much sense how this object functions if not for this basin that came with it. Right? It's actually for pouring water onto the hands, most likely. You can't. I cannot imagine actually sticking my hands into it, right? But that tells you something important: how difficult it is to study food when you don't have actual food, or when you have some remains of ancient food, and then the ceramic vessels. And the ceramic itself, it's a tool that can be used, the material can be used for all kinds of things. Some of these objects may look like vessels for eating or serving food, but actually not at all. And then I have one more example, which is a bit more speculative. So I'm a huge fan of informal accounting tools. So I wrote and published that paper on the use of tallies or sticks for counting among the Maya. And sometimes those things are more obvious. Sometimes they're less obvious. Sometimes when a bride is about to marry, the texts say she counts her sticks or she sums up her sticks. So my idea was that perhaps that expression refers to dowry. Or when captives are captured, they sometimes sum up their sticks, perhaps a reference to ransom, like a payment that they have to do. Taxpayers, they sum up their sticks when they make their payment. The problem, of course, is that those objects would be perishable, probably made out of wood, but sticks. In fact, there's one set of perishable sticks from early 20th century collected by one of the American archaeologists and now in storage at the Peabody Museum for Archaeology and Ethnology. And those presumably are for celeries. They're celery records. People literally carry their stick that records the amount of days they worked, but only 3 of the sticks actually contain names and function that way. The other 3 are something else, but also accounting tools. And of course, in Europe, people used tally sticks until the 19th century. The British Parliament famously burned because they loaded a bunch of tally sticks in the chimney and tried to burn them all at once, destroying the building in the process. Because as you can imagine, if you stuff the chimney with a lot of dry wood, the flames would be much bigger than you expect. And the main reason, of course, was to enforce or make people use paper money instead of tally sticks. Those were sort of an alternative money that was not fully controlled by the state, tax obligations from the past. So we do have images in Maya art, and it's usually plates, or sometimes those haute plates, how stick plates, which just contain bundles of stuff. And in this image, you can also see there's a person carrying another plate of the same objects. And people try to interpret them as some kind of food. They don't make a lot of sense as food items. And what is also interesting, they sometimes can be seen in people's headdresses as well. So here you can see there's a bunch of stacks in the headdresses, and then another plate. In this case, it's actually a basket with these objects. So there are all kinds of ideas in terms of what these sticks or stacks of sticks or bundles of sticks stood for. For example, people argue that those were brushes. I don't know why would people carry like a bunch of brushes. The other idea that there was like mini books, like codices, like personal diaries of sorts. I don't know, like wearing one on my head doesn't sound like a great idea in the tropical climate. Like something stuccoed and painted next to my forehead. Probably not great. We do have ivory tags or like spondulus tags occasionally from Maya burials. Even that material doesn't preserve very well, but there's one set by a priest from Comalcalco. It literally says how often he offered his blood. So every time he did it, he would make a little commemorative tag that would be bound in like a set of twos and then attached to his collection, like of personal bloodletting records, with a date and reference to which god he did it. This is our only full personal bloodletting history. We can actually say like how often you're supposed to do it, about once a year. So he had time to recover. And every time he cut his genitalia, basically, he had about a year to heal, and then he would do it again. But it's interesting that it was carried on his body somehow, because they have suspension holes, as a bundle of this kind. And it was found, of course, on his body in his grave. And so the idea is that this is what they're probably talking about. And now you can wonder what the purpose of sticks like this could be, especially in the context of food and feasting. But in fact, taxation in colonial texts is often described as a kind of feast. So taxpayers arrive with the payment and then attend a feasting event when they're given food and drinks, usually some special drink, and sometimes a little cup as a gift from the tax receiver. This is perhaps what we see here. So food, especially exotic like pulque, is part of it. But then these are displays of, perhaps, that was my idea, of taxation obligations. So this is a kind of wealth display, but not indirect wealth, sort of like chunk of jade or a chunk of a bag of chocolate beans, but more like this is how much people owe me in taxes. Which is more cryptic, of course, but to anyone who understands it in my art, that would be pretty obvious, right? And that's once again about the ambiguity of my references to food and how difficult it is sometimes to figure out what is actually going on. Like food is only part of these scenes. And if these are indeed taxpayers, it explains a lot that they're not very happy in the scene. This is the tensest, body language I'm aware of. They're like, not there, right? Looking probably for an end of this event, even though they're supposedly happily drinking, right? Or about to start drinking. This is, of course, the king, and he's also a little tense too, because you never know. And this is a bodyguard. So you always need a bodyguard, of course, when the taxpayers arrive, in case some of them are not happy about the rates. So food is also part of these kinds of transactions, right? So not necessarily feasting as such or consumption of food as such, but also very important things which require some kind of oiling with the help of special food and drinks, like in this case, perhaps paying taxes.